Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Have an excellent Wednesday, everyone. Now, pay attention because the Detroit Lions finally have some genuinely encouraging news after what had been a rough stretch. And when you look at everything that happened, there are several developments that could be much more important than they first appear. The biggest thing right now is that not every piece of bad news is turning into a long-term problem. And that is a major reason for Lions fans to feel a little better about where this team stands. One of the first positive developments is the return of Mekhi Wingo. For a moment, there was real concern that Wingo could once again be unavailable, but now he is back in the picture. Wingo is an undersized defensive tackle, but there is something about his game that makes him interesting. He played all 4 years at LSU, and one of the things that stands out about him is his ability to get after the quarterback. This is exactly the kind of player you want to see getting another opportunity, because there is clearly something there that the Lions want to develop, and that return becomes even more interesting when you look at what is happening with the defense as a whole. The front seven may be getting most of the attention right now because of the big names and expectations surrounding that group, but the secondary is starting to make some noise of its own. That matters because a defense is not going to reach its potential if only one part of the unit is performing. Another major development is the signing of Josh Dobbs following Teddy Bridgewater's retirement. Obviously, Bridgewater's departure is going to be noticed, especially because of how much respect and affection he had from people around the team and the fan base. But if we separate the person from the football player and look strictly at the backup quarterback position, the situation may not be as dramatic as some people think. If you simply compare Josh Dobbs and Teddy Bridgewater from a football standpoint, the Lions are not suddenly facing a completely different situation. Neither one was the definitive answer if Jared Goff were to go down. That is an important distinction. Bridgewater was well liked and his presence will certainly be missed, but the bigger question for Detroit is what happens behind Goff and whether someone else on this roster can develop into a legitimate option. That is where Luke Altmyer becomes particularly interesting. Altmyer has been receiving attention because of the way he has handled himself when speaking with the media, and according to the information coming out of the team, he has looked comfortable discussing what he is doing. Dan Campbell likes what he sees from him, and the message appears to be simple. Now he needs to play. That is why the preseason becomes so important for Altmyer. At this point, the Lions need to see what he can actually do on the field. Talking about potential is one thing, but getting meaningful snaps is another. If he is going to have any chance of challenging for that backup role, the coaching staff needs to give him an opportunity to show what he can do. And honestly, there is a strong argument for letting him play as much as possible in the upcoming preseason action. Because if Dobbs is not the answer, and Bridgewater was not necessarily the answer either, then why not find out what Altmyer can bring to the table? That brings us to another situation that initially sounded much worse than it may actually be. Cade Mays' injury. When the news first came out, the reaction was understandable. Losing your starting center is never something a team wants to deal with, especially when the position has already been an area of concern. But the timeline being discussed changes the picture considerably. Mays could miss roughly 2 or 3 months, but if the absence ends up being around 10 weeks, that could put his return right around the time after the Lions' bye week. In other words, instead of looking at this as a potentially season-altering situation, there is now a possibility that Mays misses only the first several games and then returns after the bye. That does not make the injury good news. It is still a significant loss, and the Lions will have to find a way to handle the position while he is unavailable. But the difference between missing a handful of games and missing the entire season is enormous. And this is where the preseason suddenly becomes even more important. The Lions have players behind Mays who now have an opportunity to prove that they can handle the responsibility. Juice Scruggs is one of the names in the mix, while there is also competition involving McLaughlin from Ohio State. At this stage, there is still plenty to figure out, but this is exactly why preseason games matter. These are no longer just meaningless games on the calendar. When you have players fighting for roles and trying to prove that they can step in when injuries happen, and injuries are going to happen, that is part of the reality of football, and the Lions are already dealing with it. The question is how well they can absorb those losses without allowing them to completely change the direction of the team. That same question applies to the secondary, where the Lions had a very encouraging day in practice. The defensive backs stood out, and Chuck Clark was specifically mentioned as one of the biggest standouts. Clark made a strong play and nearly made another one, showing exactly why his experience could become so valuable for this defense. He was a starting safety for the Steelers last year, and now the Lions need him to step into a much bigger role with two of their safeties unavailable. That is a big responsibility, but it is also an opportunity. Avonte Maddox was also praised for his work, and DJ Reed was mentioned when he has been available. The competition is clearly happening across the secondary, and that is something Lions fans should watch closely as the preseason approaches. But there is also one area where the news is not nearly as positive, and that is Terrion Arnold's situation. The reports indicate that Arnold has dropped firmly to the second-team defense, with Nick Whiteside moving into the starting lineup while Reed is out. At the same time, Arnold has not been particularly impressive on special teams, while Whiteside has been making progress there. That does not mean Arnold's story is finished. There are still weeks of practices ahead, and there is still plenty of time for things to change. But the expectation is clear. The Lions need Arnold to play at a starting level, especially given where he is in his development, and right now the reports are not showing the consistency the team needs from him. That is one of those situations where Lions fans have to stay level-headed. There is plenty of positive news around this team, but not everything is perfect. Some players are taking advantage of their opportunities, while others still have something to prove. And that is exactly what makes this part of the year so interesting. The Lions have more practices ahead, preseason games are coming, injured players are trying to work their way back, and players like Altmyer, Scruggs, Whiteside, and others now have an opportunity to change how the roster looks before the regular season arrives. So when you put everything together, the message is actually pretty clear. The Lions are in good shape, but they need to get healthy, and they need some of these competitions to start producing answers. Mekhi Wingo is back. Josh Dobbs gives the Lions another option behind Jared Goff. Luke Altmyer has an opportunity to prove that he deserves more responsibility. Cade Mays' injury may not be as devastating as it initially appeared, and the secondary is showing signs of life at a very important time. But the question surrounding Terrion Arnold is still something worth watching closely. With all of that in mind, what do you think is the most important development for the Lions right now? The return of Mekhi Wingo, the quarterback competition behind Jared Goff, the situation at center with Cade Mays, or the performance of the secondary? And that is really where the Lions find themselves right now. There is a lot to like, but there are also a few situations that need to be watched closely, because this is the part of the year when small problems can quickly become major problems if the team does not have enough depth behind its starters. Take the center position, for example. Losing Cade Mays for a significant portion of the early part of the season is not ideal, but the situation could have been much worse. The important thing is that Detroit has options, and now those options have to prove they can handle the job. Juice Scruggs is one of the players who could become very important here, while Seth McLaughlin is another name to watch. This is exactly why these preseason practices and games matter. The Lions do not necessarily need someone to become Cade Mays overnight. They need someone who can keep the offense functioning until Mays is able to return. And if the team can do that, suddenly this injury looks much more manageable. That is also why I would not overlook what happens in these upcoming preseason games. It is easy for fans to look at preseason football and think there is not much to learn, but for a team dealing with injuries and position battles, there is a lot at stake. Players who normally would not receive significant opportunities are suddenly going to get more snaps, and those snaps can completely change how the coaching staff looks at the roster. The backup quarterback situation is probably the clearest example. Josh Dobbs has experience, and that experience gives him an obvious advantage. But Luke Altmyer now has something that he may not have had under the same circumstances before, a real opportunity. He has been speaking confidently with the media. Dan Campbell has expressed positive feelings about him, and now the next step is simple: play. At some point, the Lions have to stop talking about what Altmyer could potentially become and let him show it. If he performs well, the entire conversation changes. Suddenly, Detroit may have a much more interesting competition behind Jared Goff than people expected, and that is good for the Lions. Competition is exactly what you want during this stage of the offseason. You want players pushing each other because every position that gets stronger gives the coaching staff more options when the regular season arrives. The same thing is happening in the secondary. Chuck Clark is one player who appears to be taking advantage of the situation. With two safeties unavailable, his role becomes much more important, and he is showing that he is ready for it. He is not simply filling a spot on the depth chart, he is competing, making plays, and showing why his experience can matter for this defense. That is especially encouraging because the secondary needs players who can step up when injuries hit. The front seven may receive most of the attention, but the Lions cannot afford to have a defense where the secondary is the weak point. If the defensive backs continue making plays in practice, that gives the coaching staff another reason to feel confident about the overall unit. But then we come back to the Terrion Arnold situation because that is one of the biggest things that still needs to change. Right now, the reports are not where Lions fans want them to be. Arnold has moved down to the second team defense, while Nick Whiteside has moved into the starting group with Reed unavailable. On top of that, Arnold has not stood out on special teams in the same way Whiteside has. That is not the end of the story. There is still time. There are still practices. There are still preseason games. And Arnold can change this conversation by simply playing better and showing the consistency the Lions need from him. That is the challenge, because Detroit does not need players to be perfect at this stage. What they need is progress. They need players to take advantage of opportunities, especially when